Yeah, well, thanks for joining me and joining Women in Cyberjutsu for on a Saturday. Taking time to better yourself. Definitely respect that. Welcome to the Blue Team for the Win workshop. My name is O'Shea Bowens. Uh, I'll dive a bit more into myself in a second or two. I'll try to slow it down for individuals that may be trailing into the room. I was told there's a bit of a delay. So who am I? As I mentioned, my name is O'Shea Bowens, located in Boston. But have currently right out of about 20 miles south of Boston, actually, in a town called Swampscott. It's the town where the governor lives. So it's kind of cool. You get to see the protesters when they show up. So that makes for interesting days, especially over the last month or so. Currently I am the founder and CEO of No Hat Security. And majority of the time, if I'm not associating myself with something on a keyboard, you can typically find me out, playing soccer or likely snowboarding. Some other areas where you could potentially find me is Boston Security Meetup, which is or BSM. We meet every third Thursday of the month. Loads of fun. If you're ever in Boston, feel free to hop on. Just stop in for one session. Lately, it's all been virtual, like many things in security land right now. But hopefully, we get back to normal. Ideally, by the end of summer, that'd be great. I'm also one of the board members for ISSA New England. I'm on the Sands Blue Team Advisory Board. I'm the founder of a conference called SkiCon. Happens every February. Essentially, that's just a combination of like taking cybersecurity and talks at night, and then mixing that with like snowboard and ski sessions during the day. Takes place in New Hampshire. You can find me on Twitter at Sir Mudblood. Also, if you navigate to noheadsecurity.org, you can contact me there via email for anything professional. But if it's memes and just like post talking, you can just find me on Twitter. Cool. The agenda for today. We have about 2 hours. I should be able to get through all the material. I hope. I talk fairly fast also, so I'd be shocked if I don't. But I did go a bit overkill because, like, anytime anytime most people speak, you have this idea of what you want to do. And I've done this multiple times, and I still haven't learned my lesson. I started adding things the night before. It's like the death sentence and the biggest no-no ever. So your deck goes from 50 slides to 80 and then 80 to 100. So, but I think we'll manage through. But I'll also make this available. I'll make this available somehow. I'll get with the organizers and try to figure out, maybe it's just a Dropbox link or something along those lines. There are a few different tools that I'll walk through. But I think you can definitely kind of follow along. If you want to do it right now, actually, you can just grab them as I start to announce them. They're all open source, all free. Most require like very little configuration. You don't need to build. I think actually there's one or two you may have to build, but you can take that at your leisure. I wanted to make this a bit more interactive, so feel free to ask questions as I'm moving through the content. Like I said, I'll make this available either way. So if I can't make it through the entirety of it, it's not that big a deal. As long as I feel like everyone is happy and we can talk like normal people and learn some cool stuff. Cool. So a bit about me. So majority of my career has been essentially spent from a cyber defensive perspective, either working in a SOC or security operations center, or working in a consultancy capacity. Majority of my focus has been on security analytics, the security architecture, and over the last 6 years, it began to drift more towards more proactive defenses. So threat hunting, I guess, essentially is what the kids are calling it nowadays. But moving into really understanding, how can we identify threats that are within the environment that may not present themselves in traditional manners, right? So when I say traditional manners, I mean, it's not totally visible by a SIM, or it's not totally visible, by your AV product. You likely have this bit of treasure that's just buried amongst a crap load of mud. So you're going to have to go digging for it, right? And I think that's where a lot of the security industry is essentially moving to as of late. It's not necessarily, it's not necessarily based in this place where it was, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, around having strict signature detection and relying upon that. The strict signature detection is still valuable nowadays, but majority of the time, I think the value you can provide to the security program is embracing the land beyond, right? So really understanding what's out there that you don't know, and really digging down into that. And I'll dive a bit deeper into that. So I'm gonna move this actually because this is blocking my view. 1 second, and I can't move it. Okay. Interesting. Sorry. I can't move this. I'm actually going to have to go off video because it's slowing down for me. There we go. Cool. So one-on-one, right? So networking. One of the first things I did from a consultancy perspective, but also from just an organizational perspective, is I try to understand what the environment actually looks like before you give me, a description of the fancy tools that you bought, or the latest build that you're on for this new awesome product. I essentially want to understand, what does the network look like? Could you tell me where the crown jewels are in 5 minutes or less? When I say crown jewels, what I'm referencing are essentially like the critical assets to the business, what makes the business go, essentially. So if you are in an e-commerce shop, where are you storing credit card data? Where are you processing credit card data? Where's the DB for any type of heuristics or analytics across like customer behavioral patterns, things like that. Like understanding where that is super important to me, because that gives me an idea of where I need to focus my efforts. Systems, I say systems, but you can take this as essentially kind of, I guess you can map in networking devices also. But when I say systems, I mean, what endpoints do you have in place? What servers are in place? What operating systems are essentially in your environment? You'd be surprised, and this is big and little, but you'd be surprised at how often you come into a shop that, is Fortune 100, 200, 300, and it's like, great, we're going to get this consultancy kicked off. Why don't you tell me a bit about your inventory, right? Like, what assets do you have across your environment? Do you have some type of CDB? Do you have some central repository that can give me an idea of where systems live and what type of data those hold? And then you get the the kind of oh crap face, right? They're like, yeah, well, we think this is here, right? And we think on this segment of the network, this lives here, but no one's actually 100% sure. And well, majority of the time, at least in my career, there's always like one or two people that are like the archangels of the environment, right? Like they've been there for at least, a decade. They understand pretty much every change that's happened in the environment. But those are like the gems, right? And if they're not around, you're in this position of, how do we begin to move down a path of actually answering those type of questions, right? Like what are those OSs? How many are out there, and where are they deployed? These are questions, I think moving into like while you're working in security, specifically defensive operations or blue teaming, you should kind of want to know this and understand this like the back of your hand for your own environment, especially if you're a full-time consultant. Like that's the one benefit I would say you have as being a not full-time consultant, full-time employee, is like you truly have the ability to kind of learn your environment and grow with it. And I think when you're in that position, you are almost like uniquely responsible for understanding what's around you. So when you know your systems, I think you put yourself at a bit of an advantage, mostly around different type of matrices. You can essentially like lower, and when I say lower, I mean you're bringing the percentages down, and these are the numbers that you typically present to leadership. And I know there's variant opinions on how we build out matrices, and what they should consist of and what's actually valuable. I'm not in the camp of like there shouldn't be matrix within your environment, because if you can't measure it, does it really count, right? Like if you can't sit down with senior management or your founders or your board and provide them some type of data, whether that's pretty graphs, scatter charts, whatever it may be, pie graphs or whatever it may be, and which informs them of like essentially how the money is being spent, what you're protecting, and how secure the environment is. You are essentially in a losing position, right? Like they don't, I shouldn't say they don't, because I don't know this as an absolute, but majority of the individuals that you're going to be communicating with from a business perspective, they're not really going to understand the technical bits and bytes. They just want to hear where the money's going and what's going on. So if you come in and you say you gave us $2 million and we were able to throw this EDR solution into place, and this new EDR solution is just especially equipped to detect lateral movement via LSAS dumping, monitoring, and tracking users' behavioral patterns across the environment. They're not gonna know what the heck you're talking about. But if you come to them and you say, hey, listen, with the $2 million that you gave us, we have a time to detect, an average time to detect threats within our environment from 2 to 5 minutes. That 2 to 5 minutes is based upon the time that a threat is active, meaning that an attacker actually does something from a manual perspective, like trying to touch a file, they're trying to move throughout the environment, and you can highlight that with where you were previously. That's a better conversation. So if you come in as it's June right now, as of June, we have a time to detect of around 3 to 5 minutes. This is actually down from like May or April from 8 to 10 minutes. These are actually totally fictional numbers, but 8 to 10 minutes, that's a lot more valuable to someone like that. And from a networking perspective, there are certain advantages you have in regards to really just, again, going back to knowing the network like the back of your hand, right? So one of the things that I've learned, I'm 36 currently, but one of the things that I learned probably in my early 20s was if I understood what part of the environment the assets lived in, it shortened the time for me to leverage our tool set and the queries that were of value to me. So what I mean by that is if I understand my network and I understand that, VLAN 2 is essentially where the DBs live. VLAN 3 is where we store user purchases for whatever we may sell. We sell Windows. Using VLAN 3 as a purchaser for those Windows, and that's also the analytics, one of the analytics programs that our sales individuals leverage to determine where sales are trending, right? So if there is an alert that triggers and I automatically know, hey, go ahead and check out VLAN 3 because like the third octet of that IP looks very similar, it falls within that range. I'm at an advantage already because I don't have to go request like a network map, or I don't have to really have to do a lookup on what that particular IP means. Like when it's kind of ingrained in the back of your head, you shorten the time you need to actually move into your analytics and response efforts. Wait, 1 sec. This is actually a bit out of order. That's weird. 1 second, sorry. That's weird. Sorry, I think I just hit the wrong Zoom channel. Sorry about that. Share again. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so moving from understanding your environment and understanding your systems. This is an area that I think the majority of us are finding ourselves in, especially if you're working within a SOC. It's really this place of like, moving towards quote unquote threat hunting and integrating incident response into your program, and truly understanding where that value is from a money spent perspective, but also understanding what toolage you actually need in the environment. And we're going to dive a bit deeper into how you actually reach like this kind of cohesive picture that's here. but just know this part of it, that it's essentially built upon like two different areas, and that's understanding the networking side and understanding the system side. From a system side, there's like multiple tools you can leverage to kind of map out, really kind of map out what the baseline is for your systems, right? So if you can use like a RobMD, or you can use like assist internals, or you're in the position where you're lucky enough to have the capabilities to take golden images. Really, I shouldn't say lucky enough, that you are actually taking golden images. Golden images mean like you understand what the desktop team, or maybe IT operations or tech operations, whatever they may be called within your environment, you understand what image they provide to users anytime they spin up a machine, or anytime they deploy a laptop to someone. And when you understand that, you can take that image, run diffs. You can run like diffs against memory and disk, and begin to determine like, hey, what sticks out? What's abnormal here, right? And this is before you even move into alerting. We'll dive a bit more into that part, but I think of, and this is going to be listed towards the end. If you're in a position where you do have that direct relationship with the sysadmins or your IT operations, ensure that you actually take some time and like sit down with them and try to just communicate with them on a human to human level. Majority of the wins that I would say I've had inside of like a full-time type of role really were accompanied by the relationships I had with other IT teams, right? Them being able to assist me in a very quick fashion when I'm stuck on something. Was basically like predicated upon like me spending time to get to know them and learning as much as I could from them about our environment and about our builds. And on this side here, I think this is something that we've all been fairly familiar with, right? When you're moving into a new role, right? You walk into that new role and you're sitting down with different individuals from different teams, and the conversation comes up around like, hey, I definitely would love to understand like what the network looks like. Can you help me out there? And at least I know I've been here personally numerous times, and you ask for like a network diagram, and they Slack you or email you this like architectural fact or artifact, really, of like a network diagram that's 3 years old, 4 years old, and that's like the best they have. And when you move into, which if that happens, I think you're just gonna have to learn to deal with it. You can't. It's very difficult to push networking teams or DevOps to create a new diagram like on the fly. So this is where, when I mentioned understanding your systems, leveraging different tools to understand like the baselines, like that's where I'm of the mind that that's like totally on you, right? Like you can't. I find it a bit unacceptable to say that you don't understand the environment in its entirety because someone didn't give you the most recent networking diagram, right? I don't think it actually like plays out that way. Yeah. So what's wrong here, right? So you've been given this network diagram, and as it was dropped off, you analyzed it, and within like 3 to 5 minutes, you begin to understand like, okay, well, something's off. You know, and you really start to question, how valuable, how valuable something like this like actually is. I guess I can take a question. Like, does anyone kind of like just take a quick look at this and kind of tell me like what essentially is potentially wrong with this type of diagram? I'll just wait like 10 seconds. If no one answers, I'll just dive into it. So when I look at something like this, it doesn't really, it's not indicative or detailed enough to tell me where the value is within the environment, right? So if you were to hand me this as an incident responder or as a consultant coming into your environment, and you say, hey, this is what our network looks like. It's great to have and it's a nice to have, but it's not super valuable because it's not really, oh, I think there's a question. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to get to the question, but I can't. It's like your mouse is like gone or something. Oh, doesn't list network address. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's another one too. Thank you, uh, Jessica. Yeah, so it doesn't list any type of network addressing. So that's, not the best way to move forward when you're trying to understand the network. But also, like, it doesn't tell you anything in regards to like what you should be after, what you should be potentially monitoring. As an incident responder, I can personally attest to this. I've been called inside of environments. Sometimes pre-breach. Most of the time, it's like post-breach, and I get thrown something like this, and they're like, "Hey, help us out. This machine, this user's machine was ransomware. They're asking for this much Bitcoin. What do you think is actually happening here?" And one of the first things I typically ask, like, okay, give me an inventory of your systems. If you have some type of CMDB, I would definitely want to take a look at that and give me some type of networking information. And this is, I say that in a very nice and collegial and like pleasant fashion. Um, but yeah, a lot of times you get something like this and it's not super, super valuable. I'm trying to move. Oh, wait, now I can't get the chat off my screen. Zoom, you are awesome today. I legit cannot move this. Sorry, I can't move I can't navigate the windows for some reason. Once I go large, I can't actually see anything. It's a little just concerning. Cool. So yeah, I was actually just having this conversation about threat modeling. Actually, yesterday. So there's someone here in the Boston area, a woman named April Wright. She's super awesome, like really great at AppSec. And we were on a call last night for, we were actually on a call for the CFP review for B-Sides Boston. And we were just speaking about threat modeling and whatnot. And like, we were jokingly saying, there is no one that's going to like truly threat model for you, right? Like that professional that's going to come in and threat model 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, like that doesn't really exist. Like that's I shouldn't say it doesn't exist. That's like a unicorn, right? When you find yourself in this position, especially when you're moving more into leadership type of roles within cybersecurity, and you're responsible for not only individuals, but you're responsible for systems that it's, the way I look at it, your reputation is essentially linked to the next breach. So like the breach follows you wherever you go, right? But if you are in this position where you think someone's going to lay this out for you, you may be waiting a very long time. And what we have here is essentially one format of the end result of running through a threat modeling assessment, right, or a threat modeling project. If you're unfamiliar with, threat modeling, the simplest way that I would describe it is really taking and documenting what I was speaking about previously, right, from a network and systems perspective, understanding what's in place and what isn't in place and what's important and different levels of details around the critical assets within your environment. So when you think about that, the first question that comes to mind is like, hey, how do I actually get there? How do you get there? It can be done a multitude of ways. If you're fairly new to it, I was just looking at the Microsoft threat modeling process and architectural diagrams. They've been at it for a while, and they have a pretty good process down around like how you actually move towards threat modeling. It's super convoluted. I'm just going to get that out there. Nothing against like Microsoft; they do like awesome work. I'm a big fan of like the ATA product that they came out with. So it's almost like we're probably going to be in a place in a couple of years where Microsoft may just take over the EDR scene. But that's something where you're going to need a team with you. If you're like me and you've been inside of roles where you're either an individual contributor or you don't have a lot of resources, you're going to have to get a bit creative, right? And this is super simple stuff. This is leveraging like Draw.io, which you can just leverage, which you have access to if you have a Google account, right? So you take that, essentially you're taking that network diagram that Mr. or Mrs. Network engineer or DevOps gave to you, and you're slowly starting to like map out things from structural to detailed to identifying critical. So here we just have, super simple network diagram, nothing super fancy here, and no IPs, sorry, and no detailed address information. But all we really need to know is like, okay, from user land to we'll just go ahead and declare like the gray area to the right, like PCI. From user land to PCI environment, right? How does the individual get there? We know they have to traverse at least one firewall. There's likely some core switch that's lying around somewhere that routes traffic to different areas of the network from database side to those crown jewels that we're speaking about. And also likely if you're a forward-facing company, when I say forward-facing, I mean like a SaaS company that offers a product online, there's likely going to be some type of reverse proxy or WAF sitting between you and the external networks outside of your environment. So you can communicate, which is essentially like how you communicate with our users. Or maybe you have a CDN that sits between there. You have an Akamai or another company that kind of handles that WAF and proxy and NATing for you. But all we're really doing here is step one, take simple stuff, take what you know, document that down, draw it out. I recommend, Draw.io is kind of perfect for something like this. There's a lot of other networking tools you can use, but sit down for about a day, use Draw.io, begin to move towards like a more cohesive understanding of where the value is. Something you can take away if you were to review the Microsoft documentation around threat modeling is kind of breaking down your boundaries and your data entries. So if you take a look to the legend on the bottom left, that's essentially kind of like moving from DE, T, and P. So data flow, entry point, trust boundaries, and protected resources or assets. Data flow is just what it sounds like, right? So for me to traverse across the network and hit an endpoint that may be responsible for timekeeping, or hit an endpoint that is essentially the file share for my department. I need to understand, how I get there and from a layer 3 perspective, and then what those entry points are. So data flow is just really the transport side of things. The entry point is essentially like the endpoint that's sitting in front of it, like how you actually get there and how you need to authenticate. Trust boundary. Trust kind of is always indicative of like who can touch it, right? This is probably like a whole other talk. I know I gave this before about literally leveraging like 80 groups from like local admin to super domain, and from a defensive perspective, leveraging something like a Plumhound to map out, what the likely targets are, and then begin to move backwards in your architecture and in your deployment of different tools to understand what gaps are available that you potentially miss with the architecture of the tool. That's like a whole nother talk, but but that's moving more towards like, what are our trust boundaries? Who can touch this? Who can authenticate to this domain? Who can actually make a new group? Who can make new users? Things along those lines. And then protected resources and assets. And that's just what it sounds like. Think about protected resources as like your crown jewels. With the day and age we live in, majority of the time your crown jewels, if you're a forward-facing company or a SaaS company that sells like some type of product, it's going to be PII or which is essentially customer information or credit card data. That's what the bad guys and girls are after, or bad people, are after. So that's what you essentially need to understand. And then then once you move from actually mapping out the TDEVs, you're taking this and you're moving towards like an input phase. By input phase, I mean it shouldn't be only you that validates this level of detail, but also validates what potentially could be an action item. So when I say an action item, you're not doing this for the fun of it, right? That there's some objective that you're looking to hit. And that objective is typically around, either building defense in depth type of strategy, or the deployment of something that can help you move towards a more secured environment. As you're moving down this path, from a systems perspective, here are just some quick little logs. We'll dive more into the logs in a bit, but here are just like some quick logs that you may want to have an idea of like where they exist within your environment. Obtaining these is like childishly easy nowadays. It's nothing to drop, sysmon on a box, and then 514 over that to a central log server, or you throw a log slash agent on that box, and you're sending those logs to like a Kibana or Elk build or something along those lines. But these are some of the identifiers to kind of keep in mind. We're gonna come back to this again, but I definitely wanted to just kind of get it in front of you. And also these, at least for a Windows environment, these are the type of logs that I actually have is like printed out. I still do. I mean, people make fun of me or whatever, but I have like printouts at my desk of certain logs of interest from a Unix and also from a Windows perspective, because it helps me if I'm stuck or just need to like have a quick refresher while I'm moving through an investigation. So what are you doing with all this stuff that you're kind of moving towards, right? So we spoke about, mapping out your environment, leveraging something like a sysinternals or a RobMD or leveraging like Draw.io to map out the networking side. So moving from understanding system baseline into moving from baselining to really understanding like what your network looks like and where your efforts are going to be focused. So that puts us in a place where as we're moving into the area of differ or IR, we're likely better positioned to be much stronger responders, really. And one of the things I think about when I'm managing teams and building teams that I'm kind of neurotic about is how are we getting better from an incident response perspective. I'm going to dive a bit more into this later, but really, how are we shrinking? How are we shrinking our mistakes? So if we were bitten once by this particular, some weird piece of like Java or PHP that was hanging out on a user on a website that a user was able to interact with and actually leverage that to like load additional code into a page, and we caught that. Now I'm thinking, okay, well, if they were able to move down that route of actually leveraging our websites against us, just due to like crappy input filtering or just like really bad validation on the website, how can I get better, and where else is that likely going to occur within our environment? Then we'll dive into that. But so incident response. Incident response has definitely come a long way, mostly thanks to like the community that we're in. A lot of people are doing like really, really awesome work and putting out like loads of tools. You have like Roberto Rodriguez with like the threat hunting project. You have Taylor and Swift with Sysmon config. Although that sounds super simple, I always tip my hats off to people that are essentially looking to make our lives easier from developing more tools. And I think it's awesome, and as a personal thing, to kind of contribute to that. So if you can help with a piece of code, and you can help commit, or you can help kind of like enhance something, I think that makes us all stronger as defenders. One of the rallying cries, I guess, essentially is like, if you think about it from a holistic perspective, the more defenders that we have that are stronger in their skill sets, the safer the internet essentially becomes, right? So, the bad guys can only hide in so many different places. There's only so many, different like cloud services they can bounce to before their infrastructure is discovered and kicked out, right? There's only so many bullet hosting companies that they can go to actually host like physical infrastructure, right? So it's the better that we become, the more safer really the internet is, and in a sense the world, right? If you look at majority of the crime that actually happens across not even just across our country but across the world, cybercrime is becoming like a 30, 40, 50% contributor to like what global crime looks like. If anyone reviewed the Verizon DBIR report that came out in May, I believe. I think it was May. That came out in May. One of the things that was listed there was essentially this rise in cybercrime, right? Like essentially, like when I say cybercrime, I mean like organized crime. So think about those old mafia movies where you would see 5 or 6 gangsters sitting at a table with discussing how they're going to rob a jewelry store, how they're going to rob a bank, and whose crew is going to be responsible, whose crew was responsible for like munitions, whose crew was responsible for planning, whose crew was responsible for bribing the guard. That's essentially the tack that organized crime has taken when it comes to security. One of the things, this is maybe a bit off topic, but one of the things that's really of interest to me, especially lately, is when you hear about sim jacking or sim hijacking or SIM card hijacking, that is quite possibly one of like the simplest attacks to pull off that can gain so much value, right? And think about how that really happens. Does that really require someone to be, proficient at developing like exploit kits or developing malware or creating tools? No, not really. It's as simple as going into, a Verizon or a Sprint affiliate store, which these affiliate stores have full access to customer data, bribing someone there for the phone number of like a target, and then essentially using that to spoof their SIM. And then from spoofing their SIM, you move into a place where you're receiving messages. If you can receive their messages, you can start requesting password resets. And what's the top way that individuals, receive their password resets from a two-factor authentication perspective? They get a text message, right? And this is all like super, super simple stuff. And I know it's somewhat off topic, but if you think about it from a cyber crime perspective, that is, you give 8 to 12 people like $5,000 and tell them to go out and bribe as many people as they possibly can at these affiliate stores, you're likely going to see a pretty good return, especially with individuals that are making like minimum wage. So when I say making the internet safer, like I truly do like believe that like the better we are, the more stuff that we can essentially snip out and build upon other brothers and sisters that are like fighting a good fight from a defense perspective. So we'll run through the IR stages. I'll try to go through this fairly fast. Not fairly fast. I don't want to like just skip over it, but what we'll essentially do is just walk through the different incident response stages. If you're familiar with it, just bear with me if you're unfamiliar with it. And you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to answer it. So you're starting off with preparation. Preparation is basically the key for rapid response scenarios. Typically, this involves some type of security program, whether that's a full-fledged team or a CERT or a computer security emergency response team. These are people that are staying in place with the toolage, the plans, the policies, the individuals that are ready to rock and roll once an incident were to occur, or if an incident were to occur. Sorry, but from a preparation side, you have the individuals that are responsible for communications. The big thing I typically walk away with after I don't know, almost like 12 years of doing this is you can be as technical as and wonderful as you could be, but if you have crappy communications and crappy communication plans set up within your environment, it's almost like an invite to fail in a sense, because if no one understands what the other team is working on, there's no one coordinating these type of things. It can become, one nightmare is the breach or a suspected breach due to activity and confirming activity that looks super, super sketchy. Now you're in a place where, you have individuals that are tripping over your own alarms because they're leveraging like artifacts from an investigation that hasn't totally been like handled appropriately. And I say handled appropriately, I mean the individuals that are responsible for gathering the artifacts aren't storing and communicating what they have, and are communicating that up to like an incident commando or incident lead, and other individuals are perhaps replicating those efforts or stepping on top of those efforts by triggering more alerts by navigating to domains of interest or searching for like IPs of interest that have come from that have been found during the investigation. So also with from IR, I think this kind of detection analysis in my mind is it's right between identification and containment, but detection and analysis is really moving towards like, okay, well, we know what has happened based upon the first few indicators. Now we're positioning ourselves to dive and tear apart what these alerts are and begin to paint a much broader picture of what's actually occurring within our environment, right? So now is where you have, if you're in a position where there is someone leading, you have that incident command or that IR lead who's stating, okay, well, someone take a look at these servers that are relevant to PCI. Someone take a look at our proxy. Someone dump logs from ELB or WAF. You start to receive directions around what tasks to be tackled, documented, and acclaimed, right? Oh, sorry, I skipped one. Sorry. Yeah, in a second, in another subset of like detection and anomalies, really just prioritizing, the incident with other activities. Something to remember. I think something to keep in mind is that because one incident is happening, you aren't safe from something else triggering within your environment. So what I mean by that is, yeah, it's Saturday the 20th of June, and we're investigating an incident that occurred 2 days ago. But now, at 4 o'clock, a new incident just pops up, right? So how do we shift or divert resources to handle that? So it's constantly kind of like understanding what's happening around you, having someone in a leadership position of drive efforts, but also ensuring that you're documenting actions, you're storing your evidence. If you need to make any forensic imagings, you're doing that soundly. You're not touching those afterwards. Things that you learn over time when you're moving through security operations role or incident response roles, or just like cyber defense roles or blue teaming. Containment. So containment is definitely one of the more important ones, I would say. And this is like a tricky area you may find yourself in regards to like responding to incidents, right? So one question that I've seen present itself numerous times, and I'm pretty sure it will likely happen again in my life, is do you allow the attack to continue or do you cut them off, right? So there's pluses and minuses to both sides of this argument. I've been successful and I've been unsuccessful on both sides of this. There are times where, you may be in a position due to preparation and just really, really awesome architectural and engineering work, where you can actually identify where the attacker is going within the environment in real time. You have tripwires set up across the network. You understand which systems are essentially being moved or essentially being touched via like interactive logins, which is a big indicator of like some type of lateral movement. You understand where credential dumps could potentially occur because you're seeing, Windows API calls to like LSAS, right? And you're looking at that type of activity, so you can begin to make determinations of, okay, they're in this segment of the network. They're looking at these users. Out of these users, that they begin to essentially dump hashes from the domain. We can make an estimation that out of the 12, they're going to essentially try to target one of these 5, because one of these 5 has a higher level of access or just or higher privileges. And the other side of that is, well, do you want that to continue, right? Like, do you feel comfortable enough allowing this attacker within your environment to continuously move around, or is it time to pull the plug and kick them out? And I say pull the plug, I'm not in any way like advocating for like just tearing the server down and just like pulling the plug and actually taking the server offline. I think you lose a lot of valuable information when you go that route. So I typically don't suggest it. But what I mean is, is it time to make another proactive adjustment from like maybe from a layer 3 perspective, and you're blocking IPs based upon the time you spend investigating this particular actor, and you start to cut off paths and corner them within the network. It's tough. I don't have an answer for it. I think you just have to do what's best for your environment and just be prepared to take the good with the bad, essentially. Also in containment, one of the things that we mentioned this from a long-term perspective, from a short-term side in regards to making that quick decision of do we just terminate? But if you're thinking like the long-term plan, something that I typically advocate for is, even if I've had polite disagreements with people about this, but even if you actually are in a position where you feel like you have them cornered, or you are going to start pulling triggers and cornering them to different segments of your network, or removing their access that they've currently obtained via like priv escalations. It may be a good idea to reach out to a second and third party that you leverage from an incident response retainer perspective, just to like let them know what's going on, and also begin to bring in a bit of help, because sometimes plans go awry if you feel that you definitely have this individual cornered, they're not in a position to, elevate privileges anymore. They're not in a position to try to authenticate to another system, and then they do that. That is, it's shocking to see something like that happen. But also, you're in this position of like, well, you allowed it to happen because it continued over this grace period of time, and you felt, fairly confident that you would be able to kind of interject and stop them, right? But now that you haven't, they're beginning to, they understand, one, that you're watching, but two, maybe they just go, screw it mode. I'm already blown, and just start tearing systems down, right? And that's quite possibly one of the most stressful events I think I've ever had inside of an environment, from an incident response perspective. Like when the attacker knew, on one particular instance, actually, the attacker began to understand that we were watching him or her. I don't know who it was, honestly. It was a person, a human. But once they began to kind of understand, like, hey, wait, I had access to this particular segment of the network yesterday, and now that's gone. Oh, wait, well, this user that out of the users that I dumped creds for, 3 of them have reset their passwords all of a sudden. And those are the 3 with the highest level of privileges, right? So they start to understand, like, crap, I think they're on to me. And depending on what their overall objective is, you should definitely be prepared for the possibility they say, screw it, I'll just tear down as much of the environment as I can, right? Definitely sucks, but, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So, like, I guess that's saying, a cornered animal is the most dangerous. Like, a cornered attacker is by far, like, is probably very, very dangerous. Like, it's frightening when people go into that mode. Yeah. So also, moving towards, like, as you're moving into eradication, this is like, you'll learn this over years and years of time of doing this, and fairly fast, especially when you're doing like incidents. But when you're in the erad or eradication perspective, ensure, the one thing I would take away from this is ensure that you're in a place where you are, like, as not 100% certain, but 80 to 90% certain that we're moving into recovery. We have totally eradicated this individual within our environment. Because the worst, I shouldn't say the worst thing, there's a lot of worse things on this planet, but one of the horrible things that could happen is, you do believe, again, you've kicked them outside the environment, you move into recovery, and somehow they still exist. Moving into recovery, essentially, if you wanted to take like the simple answer from what's actually occurring in the recovery stages, it's really just bringing your environment back up to a place of a normality. Your operation is, maybe it's missed a beat because of the incident, but you're back up and running. All systems are good to go. There's no more interference from an operational perspective. Customers can view whatever you're selling, get videos or buy shoes, whatever it may be. Basically, you're ensured that you're back up and running, and you moved into lessons learned, post-activity or post-incident activity. This is really one of those really key pivotal things that I think is a sign of like a mature organization, and that maturity statement is really based upon, like, hey, are you learning from these attacks? What are you taking away from this? Is there a lack in coverage because of an architectural issue? Is there lacking coverage because maybe you're not communicating with your devs and they're rolling out, new tools without really going through QA, or really having some type of vulnerability assessment on the code? Like, these are questions you just kind of have to answer, amongst yourselves. Cool. Good and bad. So we're getting through it. So got like an hour. Okay, cool. Well, I guess I should take a break for a second. Are there any questions before I dive through? We're going to get into some of the technical aspects of this, but any questions that I can answer really quickly? Was any of that maybe confusing or not totally understood? Anything along those lines? Okay, I think we're good. Yeah, so good and bad. So, yeah, cool. So someone asked about corner thing. a phrase I used earlier was like actually, if you wanted to corner the attacker. So what I mean by that is essentially imagine that you have an attacker inside of your network. This goes back to really understanding your environment, by the way. So I wouldn't recommend trying something like this unless you like really, really know your environment. But it goes back to having that certain level of confidence of what they're after, right? So if let's say, for instance, I'm watching this attacker. They have, successfully phished an employee. After they phished that employee, there was an outbound call that pulled down a secondary payload. We all kind of know what's happening here, right? They pull down a secondary payload, which is, the real binary that you should be worried about. The first one was just like a reverse shell outside your environment. The second one is actually bringing in their tools. But we're able to see that secondary call that's occurred, and we're able to grab a copy or forensically carve out of the traffic, some type of copy of their tools. So we understand what their tools are going to look like. So from understanding what their tools are going to do, you can make a pretty good guesstimation on what the attacker is going to do. But also looking at their behavioral patterns, right? So if you see the attacker and they are actually starting to dump, they're making LSAS calls and they're essentially trying to dump creds, think about, from that list of users, which one of those users has the highest level of privileges, right? Because they're after something of value. They're not looking around for like low hanging fruit. They're looking for someone that can get them from point A to point C. If they have to go A, B, and C through another user, fine. But when you understand what they're after, particularly around like systems they're going to try to touch, you can begin, throwing interactive honeypots in place like immediately, something like ADHD. I know Black Hills talks about this like a lot. It's a pretty cool tool. Or there's another one. Is it Honey Twist or Twist Honey? It's something along those lines. But essentially what you're doing is like you're making this guesstimation of like, okay, we think they're going to go for these 3 or 4 users creds, and these 3 or 4 users have access to these 2 to 4 systems that are critical to our environment. So you begin to route traffic from those systems to where this attacker has essentially gained a foothold to the honeypot. And from that honeypot, you're standing up services that look like totally legit, right? Like you're standing up SFTP services. You're standing up services that look like they should, that appear to have some level of authentication. And what you're kind of really hoping for is that the attacker takes that bait and jumps into one of those systems. And then once they, have moved from that system, you begin to make changes on the network, or they're essentially kind of like trapped on that box. They can't really dump any more creds. They can't really communicate with another machine. They're essentially just like living in this, cornered area of your network. And while you're doing that, you're taking, this works better on a team, but you're taking the time to look at the machines they've touched and take forensic images like immediately, right? And then determine like, hey, those tools that we pulled down earlier via like the PCAPs we were able to get, and the PCAPs we were able to attain, and understanding from a networking perspective what he or she was bringing in. Do those tools exist somewhere on these machines, right? So when you understand that those tools exist and you begin to remove those binaries or those artifacts, you cut them off from essentially having a hook back into the environment, and now they're kind of just cornered in this one segment of your network. This takes a lot of coordination. It's not something done lightly. I think you need to really, really understand your environment. But that's what I mean by cornering, like cornering the attacker. So essentially, when you're rolling through IR investigations, you're essentially on the clock, right? So you're thinking quick wins. Like, what can I do to begin to really formulate a plan and test my own hypotheses of understanding? Am I going down the right track, right? The worst thing I think you can do is kind of just like go full-fledged, half-cocked into analysis. You just kind of say, hey, screw it. We think they're on this part of the network. I want a forensic image of all the boxes on this part of the network, right? I want to start creating more, throw out some random, like not random, but let's start creating some more signatures across our SIM. Let's start unplugging machines. So, you're really not thinking clearly in a sense. So the first thing I always say is like, just take a second and breathe. Try to understand like what you're after and what you need. When you're thinking about those quick wins and what you need to support your hypothesis, look at your go-tos. And a part of this goes back to really understanding like your environment and especially if you've got the time to like grow with it. But what are those go-tos from your from an AD perspective? Not AD, I'm sorry, from an AV perspective, from an EDR perspective, net flows, things along those lines, right? So a lot of the times where I found myself in a position to actually win is because I knew the tooling within our environment had limitations, but I also understood how I can levy a secondary tool, right? So I look at it like, a good example would be I do this at times when I'm investigating incidents. If I can grab one of the binaries that the individual may have leveraged for as either the primary or secondary payload, I'll start to look at that from a reverse engineering perspective and try to pull down artifacts that I can just run simple regex wildcards against within the code, right? So if they're looking for this particular IP to check back into with the box, or they're beginning to move across the environment by slowly enumerating across file shares or enumerating across different file processes. I'll kind of wildcard out that, right? So if it's not just like, C temp anymore. It's like, okay, let's just get a broad dump of like C and then and try to determine like within C, like, did they touch anything? This is time consuming, of course, but you're really trying to move more towards like, okay, what else could I catch in the event that they ramp it up, right? Like if they go like super ratchet, not like in a housewives perspective, but like if they just like turn the knob up and they know your environment and one day maybe they've been inside the environment for like 30, 40, 50 days, but on that 52nd day they just ratchet it up and they start exfilling, they are throwing some ransomware within the environment, whatever it may be, something that goes from 0 to 100. I want to be able to kind of like say, okay, what can I quickly do to shut that down? What can I quickly do to shut this down, right? And that's really like knowing the different areas of knowing the different areas of knowing the different possibilities and what the tools can give me that are within my environment. A few different tools I think are really, really awesome for like from an IR perspective, at least from a collaboration side. I think this is one of those areas that I think we all kind of take for granted, honestly, because there hasn't been there hasn't always been this like massive focus on what to do from a future perspective once you've moved out of like IR situations, right? So what I mean is, like for instance, when I've consulted with companies, I'll get a call to come in because something weird or horrible has happened, and I'll work with maybe it's another 2 consultants that they've called in at the same time, not just myself, or they want to double down and cross their T's and dot their I's. So they bring in 2 different consultancy companies, right? So you're there with another consultant, and you're both kind of working towards the same aim, but just in a different path. But you close out the investigation. And then, you draft up your report, hand that off to whoever it may be, hand it off to the CISO, CIO, CTO, whoever it may be. And then, one of the recommendations is like, okay, well, great. Yeah, we would recommend that you build out some type of team to support incident response efforts. And they say, okay, cool. Thanks for your consideration. Thanks for the consideration. And, we'll see you later. And then, you get a call from them like 3 months later, or you run into someone that's works there and it's like, hey, did you guys ever build out that team? They're like, oh no, they decided not to do that, right? So then that was kind of like a lot of the time that's what it was in the past, but now you have a bit more collaborative efforts because teams are not just teams, but management and board of directors. There's a lot more visibility on security as a whole within an environment, right? So when you're working on a team, you have to think about how you collaborate with other individuals. A tool like Hive, is really, really great for that. That's essentially, taking a platform for your incident responders to track their successes, track their failures, track their next steps, but also a way to like correlate findings across the environment, right? And when you're thinking around the lines of like, at least in my mind, when I think about, you know, collaborating with different teams, sometimes it's not even your company. It's like you have to coordinate with like the feds, or you need to coordinate with, you know, your QSA, you know, something along those lines, right? So it's thinking like, okay, well, now I know that we have this level of collaboration. Moving from, you know, sharing the data, what's really one of the areas that needs to be like zeroed down upon when you're moving through incident response, or just, you know, blue teaming in general. And to me, that's time. If you don't understand when something totally occurred and you can't prove it, you're in a really, really difficult spot, especially if you need to speak with management, or share the findings with, you know, the government, or you need to share the findings with your QSA because maybe you're in the middle of like a PCI audit. I've had that happen to me before. Like we're literally in the middle of an audit, we're submitting items, and then an incident happens, and you know you can request an extension, but you know you can't really just drop the audit for the incident, right? So it's one of those things that if you have everything like kind of lined up, and you feel super comfortable with the way your program actually looks, you could. This is kind of lemons out of lemonade, but you could essentially work with your QSA throughout the incident and kind of like verify, you know, verify items of your program, and really look to like their strength, right? Like if you tell them that you have, you know, this level of monitoring across the environment, and unfortunately, you know, an incident occurs, but you're like, hey, well, this isn't us just stating or submitting items, declaring that we have this level, XYZ level of monitoring. This is us actually proving it, because while we're working with you, we're also dealing with an incident on the side. But going backwards, right, the area for like, I think one of the most kind of like the key areas when you're thinking about collaboration and actually sharing these types of artifacts with individuals is really getting down like timeliness, and finding a way to kind of coordinate and create timelines across the attack. And there's a lot of tools out there that do this for you. We'll dive into a few, but I think that's just like a really, really awesome place to be. If you could give me a timeline from start to finish of this date at this particular time, we saw the attacker enter the environment, or what we believe to be the attacker, using air quotes, enter the environment, to at this date and at this particular time, we saw them ratchet up their activity due to more lateral movement within the environment, but also due to larger packet sizes, them communicating to what we believe is like, you know, one of their C2 servers, right? And then those larger packet sizes are likely indicative of either a community of exfil happening, or B, them pulling down more tools to support their ongoing mission within the environment. So some really, really awesome tools that can definitely help you from a collaboration and timeline perspective are Plazo. Plazo is, I don't know, it's something right now that's been baked more into other tools, which I'll dive into in a second. But essentially think of it as this platform where you can leverage or you can essentially start moving into like iterative situations during incident response, right? Like you can find a way to start to coordinate the collection of artifacts that you have. You can leverage it for like broader searches and dumping that information into like a SIM, right? So if you've collected like a massive amount of logs from a couple of different users' boxes, you're not entirely sure you're like what to do with it. You're like, hey, great, I have all this data. I just need to find a way to make it valuable. I know that they were potentially on this box, so we dumped a bunch of Windows events, and we dumped, and we dumped this, or we dumped registry. Like now we need some place to put it. So Plazo is really, really awesome for doing things like that and mixing it into really this live triage analysis, right? And when you're thinking about, sorry, this is in my way. I can't get rid of it. But when you're thinking about live triage, this is really like that stage of incident response where, now we're going into like, okay, we can't do a lot of this by just pure scripting. We need some type of tool that's going to help us out. A lot of IR, you can truly get away with just Python. I mean, if I'm being honest, you can get away with leveraging Python to create network dumps, right? Like if you were to use like PocDump and NetStack, Netstat and dump processes, you can get a better idea of like, hey, from this application to this IP, this is what it looks like over a 24-hour period, right? Like you don't even need Wireshark. Like you could legit fly under the radar, and sometimes attackers do this. Actually, do that. They'll leverage different command line flags with like a netstat and begin to like correlate application to application to IP activity, and that's a quick way to determine, hey, if I'm inside of your environment and I can understand which IPs are communicating with these particular internal applications, maybe I can find a way to either find a central console for these applications. So let's say it's something for timekeeping. I don't know. You have to, you're in this job where your boss is running a factory like it's a 1940s Ford factory, and you have to clock in, right? So if you can find a way to get to something that more users touch, vis-a-vis like a timekeeping system, and then possibly debug that, or actually get a copy of the binary and debug it and begin to find holes in it that you can leverage to further your attack. That's all the better, right? But you can also do that from a defensive perspective. If you can find yourself in a position where, or if you find yourself in a position where it's like, oh crap, I don't have Wireshark right now, or I don't have T-Shark. How can I get a quick dump of like network activity? Well, you can do something like along the lines of actually dumping netstat and processes and begin to kind of map out, hey, is this normal activity or is this just like benign, right? But when you're moving into like these triage steps, this is where the pace is picking up, and the stakes start to get a bit higher. And and the objective really is to, I say, gain as much data that's valuable to support your efforts as possible without making a mess. So when I say making a mess, that means, really, like I'll give you an example. So at one point in my career, I was working on a team. We were investigating some activity for a financial institution that was of interest. And one of the individuals had taken an image of one of the machines that was of interest. Right at this point, it's of interest, but it's not the interest, if that makes sense. It wasn't the key, it wasn't the key server that we were all zeroing in on. But this individual took this image, kind of stored it, and then about a week or so or later, something like that, maybe like, I don't know, 5 or 6 days, something along those lines, that particular box that he had created that image for, we needed to understand a bit more because we saw logs that kind of like began to point to potential activity on that box. And this individual began to commit one of the 7 deadly sins of IR and begin to run analysis on a forensic image that we should have, in all realities, we should have stored for safekeeping, and then made another one for essentially for our analysis. And throughout the next couple of days, as we were moving through that analysis side of things, someone raised the question of, hey, where are we storing forensic images? And that question came up, like, which out of all of us, how many images have we taken? Because we weren't communicating that well. But how many images have we taken? Where are those stored? And what was the reasoning behind of imaging of that particular drive? And that's when we discovered that this one individual had actually leveraged a forensic, an image that should have been made kept for forensic purposes, and had leveraged it for analysis. And from taking that to court it'd be a very hard case to win if the drive or if that disk is just like muddled up, like there's nothing. It makes it really difficult to attribute, the attackers. I mean, the activity to the attacker versus activity to us as the analysts or the incident responders at that time. but really as you're moving into like, the triage side of things, this is really like, okay, you're thinking like, oh crap, okay, well, I know I need to touch this tool. I mean, not touch this tool, I'm sorry. I need to touch this box that's across, that's within our network, right? So what do I need to do to kind of get there, right? Is it something where I can use a puppet? Can I use a chef? Is there a way that I can use like SCCM or some type of GPO policy to push an agent of to push an agent for a product that can really allow me to pull down data to support, my hypotheses going through the IR stages. And I don't really, I'm not saying that in any way should your focus be how can I get this behind, how can I get over this as fast as possible, or how can I kind of close down, how can I kind of close this incident down before the weekend, right? It's Friday, something's happening, I want to go home, I got well, no one's, everyone's at home right now, but like it's a Thursday or Friday, I want to get out, I want to go live my life, let me just run through a bit of analysis and then call it a day. So I say quick wins, but when I say quick wins, I don't mean necessarily that you're positioning yourself to, I mean, the nicest way I can say it is really you're positioning yourself not to do your best work, right? Like you're in a rush, you're not thinking clearly, and you're kind of on the move for other reasons. But if you're thinking about it from the other side of quick wins of like, hey, these are the things we need to knock off our checklist like right now, and then we can begin to dive a bit deeper into other artifacts. That's what I mean. I kind of when I say like quick, like get a quick win. So you're looking at, okay, let's look at those event logs. Let's look at like get a copy of prefetch. If I can pull down MFT and actually leverage that for analysis, like how fast can I do that? What do I need to do that? Am I equipped to do that? Or is it someone else on my team? Or is it, a buy that needs to happen while this is going on? When I say a buy, I mean like buying a tool. Like there may be times you're in the middle of an investigation and you reach or you hit a wall. Essentially, you hit a wall because you don't have the capability to continue on. You're just limited at that point. So is it something where you need to go out and get something? So there's a couple of different really, these really aren't old tools. Like most of these have been out for like at least a decade or so. But live response is definitely one that I think is, I'd say a go-to for me, I guess, essentially. If you don't have a massive budget, I guess you could say, like if you're in a position where, you're having to live off the land essentially, or get very, very creative with your budgeting. Yeah, screw it. Go with something like a live response, which allows you to pull down some of those really interesting artifacts that we mentioned earlier, right? So really, what you're looking to do is just really run a few quick commands, pull down as much as you need, not getting greedy, and then find a place to dump this, right? So with live response, you can essentially really run. You can script this out too. Like if you're in a cloud environment, what I would recommend, whether that's whether it's Azure, GCP, AWS, I would look at leveraging like Docker or Kubernetes, whatever your shop is. I don't know, but leveraging something where you can deploy these agents and script this and like user data or something along those lines to deploy and run certain searches, just like basic searches immediately. So you can, and then packaging that and then SFTPing it over or shipping it back to a central console for yourself. So you're not in this position of, well, this machine is in this area of the network and I can't actually bring it down right now for forensic imaging. So now we just have to wait. Like you're not in this like hold and wait type of pattern. You're in this really, really proactive, stage of like triaging where you're thinking, hey, how can I go in and grab something ridiculously fast and move towards analysis. Even with live triage, also like these are tools. There's another one that we're going to walk through, but these are tools that run like very fast, and you can get a decent amount of data to support your efforts. Like what I tell individuals that I like train and mentor is if you can't leverage like a live response or a CQLR to get the job done, without having to pay for something, you're doing something wrong. I mean, there's nothing against, I should say, I have nothing against like working with working with vendors or anything along those lines. But what I think you have to do as a responder and really as a security professional is really learn to do more with less, but also learn what works for you in a pinch. If you were to think about it from from a sports perspective, from a sports analogy side or a sports perspective, like you train and train and train to like shoot free throws or shoot 3-pointers or whatnot, and that becomes like a second nature. So the second, like the ball is passed to you, the second it's in your hands, your thought is on shot, right? Like you're thinking, go ahead and take the shot. I look at that, in no way is the intensity or even the fame and popularity the same. But I take the same mindset when it comes to what I do as a security professional, right? Like I'm always thinking like, how can I get this done without having to like build out something massive, right? Can I use a live triage? Can I use can I use a security onion? And that push me in a position where I can script out data that should be grabbed from file paths or from disk or from memory and dump that in a place where I can begin to correlate it. And can I do that? And how fast can I do that, right? Like I used to be a weirdo and I would like legit time myself when I was doing like security onion deploys or snort deploys and like bro deploys. Like I would like legit sit there and kind of like map and like watch myself, set a timer and watch myself move through it. Cause I always, in the back of my head, I guess I'm pessimistic. So I just assume something bad's going to happen at work. Like I don't want, like I love what I do for sure, but I just assume that eventually something bad's going to happen and it's going to be like go time. It may not be, right now, it may not be tomorrow, but eventually it's going to come. So the faster I am, the more, the faster I become with moving towards like fruition analysis. So when I say fruition, I mean, I'm actually producing something. I think I'm in a much better place. And when I think about, fruition, like how can I get there quickly and actually show value? These are just some of the tools that I think are like super, super helpful. So you don't have to so you're not finding yourself in this position of like, hey, we have this awesome clunky like EDR tool, but it actually can't perform like memory dumps. Okay, so now we have to throw another tool on top of that, right? And on top of that box, and then find a way to deploy it, right? Like you're thinking like, what's open source, what's out there, what can I use, and what can I script, throw out to cast out in the environment and get the job done. CYLR is another one of those tools that's like super, super cool. I'm gonna butcher. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna butcher the guy's name. That actually, I think it's two gentlemen. I know I have this at the bottom of the at the end of the deck. Can I recall this guy's name right now? It'll come to me later. I'm almost certain it will. But so CYLR is essentially like a collection tool for artifacts during I shouldn't say incident response. This could be honestly something like you're just upping yourself, right? Like you're constantly looking to get better. So there's different tools out there that you may leverage. The CYLR is pretty lightweight, and it can grab a crap load of like forensic artifacts with hosts fairly fast, like under kind of under 10 minutes. And if you remember kind of like what would happen when you had to use like an encase for some of this type of stuff and how long that actually took, these are tools that can get it done like super fast and put you in a position where you're rocking and rolling into your analysis. CDQR, written by the same gentleman that made CYLR, and the primary difference is now it's time to parse, right? So you collect it, which is great, but now you need to move towards like of actually parsing this information. And I know I mentioned Plazo earlier, but this CDQR actually leverages Plazo too. So not only is, what is his name? It's like Oliski. I'll find it later, but it's like Olaski or Oliski. I can't recall his first name. Maybe someone can put it in chat for me. But one of the cool things that he did when he made this, which I'm like a big fan of, is that he didn't go. He didn't like move in this place where he created something so new that it was foreign. It was like foreign to like learn it, right? Like the concept was just something like a jar. He built upon, I believe his time as like an analyst or incident responder, but also like thinking about like, hey, what does a community actually use? Community uses Plaza. Community uses like Kibana. So how can I like build something and bake that into it? And CDQR is like really, really awesome for doing something like that. And once you actually have those images, once you actually have that information again, now it's time to place it somewhere centrally, right? Like, so it's really quick searches, depending on how granular you want to go. But if you know, again, like if you know kind of where the attacker has gone by, maybe you have logs for get and post requests, and you kind of determine like, hey, they're pointing to this file path, so let's look at anything written or anything added, to that specific file path, and let's just dump it all, and we can sort through it, right? Super easy tool to understand. Comes pre-canned and pre-built, so you don't really totally need to like sit there and walk through the build process. You can leverage these just by navigating to the Git repo, setting up a VM. I think actually one of the cool things I just got his name right, Mr. Orlaski or Orliski. Sorry if I'm butchering your name. One of the cool things that he did was actually build out this really, really cool web UI, and with Sparky, but essentially they've done and what you can do, and what I suggest like checking out and just trying for yourself, like grab some random samples from like Malware Zoo in a segmented like VM type of environment, but also throw CYLR onto a box, get imaging, post, and pre and post malware execution or threat execution within the environment, and then run it. Go ahead, get those dumps from a memory dump perspective, from a disk perspective. Again, going to quick wins, right? So how can you get those quick wins and become faster in your day to day? So now you're not just targeting. Maybe you don't need a full, a full disk image, right? Like maybe you can get by with just like a file dump, right? And then at least within a Windows environment, for sure, I would say like within Windows environments, a lot of the time you can get by with just kind of understanding like, hey, what are they looking to touch? Like, what calls can I see from dumping memory, right? Like if I'm seeing a bunch of Windows API calls around like creating services, or I'm seeing create process, like enum processes. Like if I'm seeing calls like that, I can begin to determine that, okay, I think this individual is essentially trying to enumerate within the environment, right? Versus when I see things like if you're thinking about it from a malware analysis perspective of like, hey, well, why am I seeing these weird find like resource calls, like, right? Like, why am I seeing like find resource being spun out? Being hit from a login perspective. Like, what the heck is this person doing? That's more indicative of like, hey, well, maybe they're trying to like blend in and gain some level of like persistence. And with that being their objective, you only have, it's hard to put a time limit on this. I'd say you have a small window depending on the capabilities of that attacker, because eventually they're going to be gone from that system, right? So when you're dealing with someone fairly advanced, one of the ways I kind of, when I think about it, is like, if they go dark after like being a bit noisy, they likely have some level of skill, right? If you never hear them and all of a sudden it's just like this ratchet of like weird outbound traffic, or boxes and process or utilization slowing down where you've never seen that before, on certain segments, on certain machines within certain segments of your network, like that's like, okay, maybe it's someone that has a bit of skill, right? They're not tripping a lot of alarms. The alarms that they really are tripping are machine based, right? Like they weren't able to control, like, as they're pulling down artifacts from like this, maybe like the utilization shot up. And that wasn't something they were totally able to control. But if we're being honest, like who's really going to catch that type of stuff, right? Like, are you really looking through or creating like Datadog searches to like look at small like spikes and drops across servers that aren't like application facing or that actually don't serve up the app? Like probably not. So like those small little steps they may take to actually move throughout the environment could easily be missed. But this goes back to what I said around constantly testing yourself, right? Like how fast could you identify that traffic if you do I just see that one misnomer, right? I think a lot of things, maybe this will become a bit clearer over the next couple of years, but I think a lot of the times when people talk about like threat hunting, like when I talk about threat hunting, that's kind of what I'm referencing to, is like those really weird kind of like spikes or misnomers that aren't all that weird, because I guess in reality, like the smaller the event and the less frequent the event, like the more it kind of stands out to me, right? Like if I see something like along those lines, or like that really weird spike from a machine that maybe has some type of PII, or maybe is next in line, say like as a jump host, or maybe it's a VPN concentrator, something along those lines, like that it's either directly communicating with a box of interest. Those are things that you really want to determine, like, hey, okay, well, there's this one small misnomer of like CPU spike is sitting up to 60% with these 5 or 6 processes that were called, right? Well, let's look at one of the boxes that it has some type of relationship with from a GPO perspective, right? Like, and inside one of these, on one of these boxes, maybe I don't see that utilization spike of a 60%. Maybe I see that utilization spike up to like a weird 30 or 40%. But those same processes are called, right? So that's kind of like, oh crap, maybe they are leveraging some tool or some piece or some piece of malware that they are kind of like they're continuously like adjusting, and that's not uncommon for attackers to like find a hook in and kind of lay around and wait, and the hook that they have, that one piece of malware is kind of continuously being edited and updated. They're just slowly getting better the more you learn about your environment. But when I think about what we say is threat hunting, and and then this is just O'Shea's opinion. This isn't like gospel, but what we say is like kind of like threat hunting versus like, well, is that really threat hunting? Is that just responding to events, right? If you're having to go look out, if you basically, the simplest way I would kind of make that determination is if you have to go look for it because there was an alert, it's not truly in like the realm of like threat hunting, right? Because you've already been given one indicator is enough, as you've already been given, 1 or 2 indicators that something odd has happened. But when you're out searching for it yourself, not based upon alerts from a security perspective, but again, this goes back to, maybe Datadog is throwing up some weird, some weird CPU spike, it's something along those lines. And that's something you dive into and you build out, you build a hypothesis from there. Something that I honestly recommend it, especially if you're in a large environment, is really taking that time to like actually understand what your builds kind of look like. When I say look like, I mean, what do they consist of right out the bat? This is becoming, I know Dominique did a talk on cloud security, but perhaps she mentioned this also, and I think you're hearing this more like amongst people that operate in the cloud space. But when you think about like what activity or what processes or what files should be run on one of your images once it's built via Docker to Ansible to, ECS or ECR or something along those lines, I think we're moving towards a space of like, that has to become a norm for you. Like you need to be in a position that, especially if you're cloud heavy, you need to be in a position where you understand what that build should look like within the first 5 minutes of it being spun up, whether that's ECS or EC2, right? Why is it making this particular call to this specific IP after being up for 10 minutes, but none of our other containers are resembling any of that type of behavior, right? And this isn't like the talk for that. I think it's I'll probably do something like that later this year around like different cloud security and IR techniques. But thinking about like those, again, going back to misnomers, right? Like why the heck is that process being spun up? Okay, well, we know what the dependencies are for our build before we push it down the pipeline. But now all of a sudden there is this really weird vulnerable dependency that is alive, and it looks like it is actually creating a bit of noise from like a layer 3 side. Like this is where the whole know thyself thing really comes into play. So do I understand? And I don't mean this like across the entirety of the org. I don't know anyone that well, I shouldn't say that, but I don't think I really know that many people that could tell you as of June 20th, this is where we are from a patch level perspective, and this is where we are from a vulnerability manager perspective in regards like this many vulnerabilities exist at this given time right now as we're speaking, right? Like these are things you have to kind of build upon and learn within your environment. But I think it's super, super important to start to take that approach of learning that, right? And as we're moving forward down towards like, what do we do around like malware analysis? This is really, really important, because what's the top way we learn about something weird going on? It's because something triggers one of our alerting tools, right? And I put this in here twice because I think it's super important. But like having an idea of like when super, super weird logs occur within your environment can save you loads of trouble and loads of time. Seeing individuals actually seeing individuals that likely have the ability to create accounts and move things around the environment, and seeing that happen at weird times or seeing it happen out of frequency, like those are things that you should jump on like immediately. It's just one of those things you kind of have to do. Like the landscape is changing so rapidly, and it's not as if like attackers are getting slower as the days and years go on. Like they're getting much better. They're moving towards automation the same way you think about, or we think about automation from like a SIM perspective. They were thinking about that years and years ago with how their malware is deployed. When did it execute? Did it look for certain was it looking for certain AVs on disk? Was it creating some type of sleep pattern? Did it try to understand where in the world it was actually beaconing out to, like geolocation, before it actually made any calls? Like these like weird things that really became like more, I guess, quote unquote, not advanced like APT, not threats from a nation state, but really just more like advanced capabilities for attackers. They started doing this a while back. So now we're in this position where we're trying to like catch up to it, and you have to put yourself in the mindset of, how do I continuously get better, one, but also what is out there to help me? I won't go too deep in the threat intel side. Sorry, I don't want to like rant about it, but if you're moving down the path of like actually building out like threat hunting engagements within your environment, you essentially need to have intel first. Like it's almost like a no-go if you have notes, if you don't have some level of like intelligence. And I mean like data-driven intelligence, not, hey, here's what this random group is doing. No, here's what Joker Sash is up to, but you don't work in financial institutions, right? Like you're not in the financial vector. Like that doesn't really matter to you. I mean like threat-driven, like around like, hey, we have this, we're at Ubuntu 1804, and here are the latest vulnerabilities, and here are individuals that are actually leveraging these, and this is how they're leveraging it, and we can kind of map that to attacking techniques. Like you're taking that mindset on how do we marry actionable intelligence. I guess we should, in reality, I should say like threat intelligence data. How are you taking threat intel data and marrying that with hunting hunting campaigns? So I think you can't really go you can't really have a talk or a workshop without even going into attack MITRE. But something that I always try to push myself to do as as a blue teamer is really get better with like attacking. Attack to defend is not like something I just like made up. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that says this, but it's really like understanding like what capabilities exist within your environment so you can really truly think about where we can catch that bad stuff, right? So here, and I'll make this code available too. This is just a really, really simple like PHP app that was built. And all we're really doing here is really scanning, looking for a vulnerability. The vulnerability that was identified was a local file inclusion vulnerability. This is not an OPSEC talk, but this will make sense once we go down in the next slide or two. But really, all we're doing is looking for that local file inclusion vulnerability and leveraging that to drop a secondary payload onto the box. We are just simply confirming that the vulnerability exists by pumping command line syntax into the browser and having data return. And once that data is returned, it gives me an idea of like, okay, great, we know we can actually leverage this vulnerability, right? I think about this because when I put this slide here to kind of go dive into this, because when I think about hunting or building out a team member to actually go on hunts, I think about it from a pure, almost like purple teaming capacity, right? Like, okay, great. If we want to build out hunting, who can actually run the attacks with us, right? Who can do the attacks for us? And these aren't super, super hard things, right? We're thinking about what would an attacker do, right? And then second, you're going to see us map this to attack MITRE, but we're thinking, okay, well, we have these systems in our environment. We are in this particular vector. This particular vector is our targets of these particular actors, whether that's an APT 29, 33, 22, whatever it is. You're thinking and you're planning of, I'm in finance. We have these type of OSs within our environment. These type of OSs are at these pass levels. These are the actors that typically target these type of, they're leveraging exploits or they're targeting us as a financial company. And let's recreate some of that stuff, right? Like the C2 matrix, I didn't put this in here, but the C2 matrix is super, super awesome. Like Bryson Ford and a few other individuals built that. And that's essentially, building out the capability to funnel traffic from a layer 3 perspective outside of your environment. All we've done here, by the way, is like take what we move from verifying the vulnerability to dropping a payload, to dumping hashes, offloading the hashes, cracking the hashes, coming back and authenticating those. Why is that important? I think it's important to move into this type of space as you begin to map out your environment and think about hunting, because you need to prove it. Like one of the things that kind of bothers me a lot in our industry is really a lot of talk around, well, we threat hunt. Okay, well, what are your results from hunting, right? So did you lower one of those matrices that we spoke upon earlier, right? Did you lower those matrices at all? Were you able to create new matrices from that? Like, how are you proving these type of things to me as a manager or to me as like a security executive? There is a really, really, really cool tool called Detect that I like. This is open source also, but essentially what Detect allows us to do is map out, those hypotheses that we have around attack MITRE in our environment and begin to really, really kind of drill down into, from a data perspective, how do we identify it? How do we track it? And then how do we build upon it? So with attack MITRE, what you can actually do is this acts as like a JSON overlay to, with Detect, it acts as a JSON overlay to attack MITRE. So it's all written in Python, so super, super easy to do a lot of this stuff. But what you're doing is essentially looking at different attack categories and adding different data fields to them to help you really truly understand the benefit and the value of them. So you're thinking about, okay, what are those, either moving from a timeliness and consistency type of rating for a system. So when I say timeliness and consistency, let's say I have a box that is let's say I have a web app server. One of the things I need to understand is, how long has it been up? Who normally touches it? What's the retention rate for data? You want to score that, place that into a profile for one or two endpoints. And once you have it in the endpoints, what you're essentially doing is taking that data, scoring it, and then dumping it back into an attack technique. This becomes super important because if you remember a couple of slides ago, we just walked through just a simple attack of actually targeting an LFI vulnerability and then bringing in a secondary payload, dumping hashes, taking those hashes outside the environment, and then moving into cracking those. That's about 4 different areas of kill chain that would touch, right? But you don't, in most of our jobs, we're not sitting there and we're not thinking about, okay, well, how do I share this message of like, this is where I caught activity in the kill chain and make this something that's reportable. It's difficult, but you can use something like a detect and something like that on Better, and you're beginning to like map out what an attacker would likely the attack techniques that an attacker would typically leverage. This is accompanied by your intel, of course. This is why I say intel is super important. You can't really hunt without intel. And you begin building these out internally, right? So you're looking at, okay, let's look at persistence from Attack Miner, pull that down. Okay, well, where within our environment would I be able to catch some of these actions, right? If I see someone to auto run, okay, well, do we have that capability to detect it? Okay, yes. Okay, if I can detect it, can I score it? Yes. Well, how can I score it? Well, how long do we actually keep those logs? How often are those logs reviewed? And where in the entirety of the environment do those logs exist? So if it's only available within like 60% of the environment, naturally that's a lower score. So that wouldn't be, on a scale of 1 to 8 or 1 to 5, I should say, that would be like a 3 versus a 5. But if your retention rate is, let's say, 90 days per like PCI, then okay, now you're at a 5 for your retention rate, and you're marking these things into these profiles that you're keeping. So when an attack does happen, which I hope no one has to live through incidents. It's not glorious at all. It's probably one of the most stressful events you can have in your life if you think about it. And we actively do this for a living. Like we're purposely putting ourselves in these like very stressful situations at times, but you learn how to cope with it. That's why you go snowboarding, right? So what you're doing is essentially taking the data mapping, placing that back into Attack Miter. You keep track of this. Well, you don't have to. I would recommend it, but you keep track of this in like a Jira via like a story or an epic, and you continuously build out. Was that? Okay. But you're continuously building out. Did someone have a question? Oh, okay. But you're continuously building out and mapping your data sources. I know I got 15 minutes, so I'll try to walk through this. To the left, you see this is basically just the Attack Miner and leveraging like Unfetter, and just an overlay of it. And to the right is a breakdown of the different types of profiles you can create with Detect and with Python. And all you're really doing is, you can get as granular as you like. You can define it by color. I don't know if you want privilege escalation to be a red column, and you want defensive evasion to be purple, and you want persistence to be pink. You can do whatever you want, but the value really is taking a look at key areas that are reportable and that you can build upon. So this goes back to how long do you have your data? What type of data is it? Where is it available within the environment? And where is it being fed into? When you do those type of things, you find yourself in a position of like, well, I had this alert in this part of my environment. I know what exists in this environment because going back to understanding the network, I know what systems are there. I know that houses customer data. And since I know that part of it, I can immediately pull down, detect, run a search against a range of IPs for that particular area of the network and have that map to Attack Miter. And from Attack Miter, from leveraging Detect, which is the JSON layer on top of Attack Miter, I can pull down the possible avenues that an attacker would take within my environment and the type of techniques that they may leverage. And then not only not only can I search and go deeper from a behavioral perspective of understanding what they may be up to. This does take time to get there, but I can, after this is over, I take that information and I pump it right back into my profiling, and I update our whole catalog. And now you've essentially taken like one piece of data from an alerting perspective and increase that like 3, 4, 5 times over, right? There's a whole section of like malware analysis. I guess this is the problem when you add stuff, right? You get super excited. You keep adding stuff. I'll skip through most of this. The main thing from the malware analysis side that I wanted to kind of hint upon is really taking the time to look at, this goes back to the attack MITRE side of things, but taking the time to look at what attacks are out there from what attackers are leveraging, from a data exfiltration perspective. Are there, like, what are the methods that they're doing this? Is this with some type of encoded PowerShell? Is it just some really weird like shellcode? Is it some Java piece of JavaScript that they're leveraging to actually use leveraging JavaScript, inside of your application that's internet facing to poke around and begin to pull down more data than it probably should by targeting different APIs, right? When I think about leveraging as like a blue teamer or as a incident responder, when I think about what I need to know from a malware analysis perspective, the big things for me are like, and this goes back to quick wins, right? Like, how did they get in and what did they touch? I need to really understand what they touched and how they're going to get out. That how they got in, like, that is a super important, because you want to block them. But if you're able to identify them in the environment, you need to be looking at essentially like how they actually got out, or how they're trying to get out, essentially. We spoke about destructive malware. That's a horrible day. You may go, you're gonna have to decompress and meditate if something like that starts to happen. I'm gonna go through this fairly fast so I can take questions, because the malware analysis is a bit longer. Virus versus worm. That's essentially, say, old school versus new school. Worm replicates on its own. A virus has its singularly purposed. Cool. Malware formats. This goes back to what I was saying a bit ago around like the potential of exfil. There's numerous different ways to write out malware. I think a lot of us are probably in this phase, not a lot of us, but people would kind of have this one dimensional thought process around like what malware looks like. You're like, hey, it's some weird exe that I downloaded from, or that I received via like a user received from a phishing email, or it's a weird, it's a weird APK that exists in Android Play Store that I grabbed. But in reality, it can be written in like multiple different forms, from macros to batch files. Actually, macros are likely. I wonder if there's a report that shows is the amount of like breaches that were successful because they embedded macros into their code. I wonder if that exists now. Anyway, sorry. But yeah, the takeaway, malware can be in multiple different forms. Is what I'm going towards. Here are a few different resources for understanding different PE file formats for malware. This is really focusing upon like Windows primarily. One of the areas that I think you learn in the very early stages of like malware analysis is really thinking about how can I identify that within code. So you're looking for that magic byte, the MZ. Once you understand that part, I know it sounds super simple and somebody's probably going to laugh, but really once you understand where the program is, where the binary essentially starts and where that data content is, you can learn the rest of it fairly quickly. It's not, I should say quickly. You're positioned better to begin to move more towards like analysis, like malware analysis, right? Because if you don't know where it starts, how the heck you know where it finishes, and how the heck you know what it's actually doing? These are different data directories leveraging like different tools like CFF, which is what does CFF stand for? It's cross Framework Explorer. I can't even remember now. I've done this too long. But essentially, there's really, really quick tools, like going back to quick wins, right? So you're thinking about tools that you can leverage and throw inside of your environment, or put on your lab at home, and just begin to like understand, hey, what can I do in a really, really fast fashion to grab artifacts for malware? I'm gonna skip to these slides since the slides will be available. Mac OS, there's a rise in malware for Mac OS. Actually, something really funny. I don't know if it's funny, but about last month, uh, what's their name? There's one particular company that buys. They're a bug bounty company. They're not bug crowd. There's another big company, Exodem or something like that. It starts with an X, I think, but they put out a notice on Twitter like, "Hey, we are not accepting any more malware for like OS X," because they just become like overwhelmed with like exploits exploits that individuals have contributed. I mean, individuals have given them for money. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. The individuals have sold to them. So I just find that kind of hilarious. Like 3 years ago, you would have never. That would sound like a far-fetched idea to say, like, hey, eventually the companies are going to get to the point they're going to stop. They're going to be asking people to stop submitting malware for OS X. Yeah, Linux malware, mostly in ELF file formats. This is a few different things you can take away with. I'm going to brush through this and get through the questions just in case I don't want to totally ignore anyone. That's the whole point of being together, so I can talk to you. Clearly, I think this slide kind of captures the majority of the malware analysis side. But looking at quick tools that you can leverage without being like a reverse engineer or a strong malware analyst are key, right? And this will help you in your job too. Like you will look really, really cool if you can tell somebody what the malware is doing versus saying, "Hey, we got an alert for malware," right? So taking that time to really upskill yourself, right? Thinking quick wins. What can I grab that provides value to the investigation? VirusTotal is still great. Leverage the API if you're going to use VirusTotal. There's no reason to click and upload stuff anymore. Hybrid analysis, another great tool. All of these are web-facing and available, pretty much free. I think with hybrid, you need an account. AnyRun, same thing. There's an exercise. Okay, and the wrap up. I know I went through a lot of that like super fast, but and it was 2 hours, so I didn't want to go like crazy in different directions, even though I ended up doing that because I ran. But the one thing I just wanted to really relay is when you're moving into, or cyber defense type of operations or a blue teaming, that you're kind of in this awesome position where you're blessed to like not only have one singular focus. You can focus on a couple of different things, right? You can go, you can begin to like focus on like malware. You can begin to like focus on architecture. You can begin to like focus on reverse engineering and things like that. So you kind of put yourself in a position where you win by being exposed to like so much more. And with that, I can take questions in the last like 5 minutes.
No, this is wonderful. One of the questions we have is, do you mentor?
Yeah, I do. I think there's 2 people right now. One's I think actually I should probably follow up with her. She had an interview a couple of days ago. I think she may have gotten a job. But I'm gonna assume since she didn't text me, maybe she's out partying because she got a job and she celebrated. But yes, I do.
Fantastic. No, that was wonderful. There are no more questions at this time.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, thank you for joining me. Maybe I could have taken a little bit more time, but it's all good.